He's certainly unparalleled. There is no contemporary figure who could go out, announce he's going to speak, and 70,000 people would show up, whether it is in Wyoming or Red State, Utah, or at the center of liberalism in Madison Square Garden in Manhattan. No one has that ability to work like he does. He works at 78, 16, 17, 18 hours a day. Nobody has seen anything like that. You could see pictures where Kamala Harris, who's 20 years younger, was yawning, asleep, or took a whole day off in the critical last 2 weeks. It was the worst run campaign in my lifetime.
Why did Donald Trump win?
Well, he won because Joe Biden had a 4-year tenure that reminded people of what the Democratic Party really was now, and maybe they had forgotten during either Trump's tenure or the COVID lockdown and the George Floyd riots. But they were paying 30% more for their staple goods than when Biden entered office. The crime rate had exploded. The border was non-existent. 12 million people had entered illegally. The United States was humiliated in Afghanistan. There were 2 theater-wide wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, perhaps due to the destruction of U.S. deterrence. And the positions in which Kamala Harris had articulated most of her life, and especially during the last 3.5 years of the Biden tenure, she either had to ignore or change or forget, renounce, because they were not sustainable. So people said it's not so much that she's unable to speak, it's not so much that Joe Biden was demented, it's the message. It's not just the messenger. And in the post-election autopsy, the left doesn't seem to see that. They say, well, Donald Trump did this, or we should have done that, or we didn't get the message out, or Latinos are suffering from false consciousness. But it was the message, and it didn't really matter if, at the end who the message. No messenger could save that message.
Looking back on history, is Trump's story the greatest comeback story in U.S. political history?
Well, when you ask a question like that, as a historian, you just immediately try to locate other examples. There's 2 that come to mind. One is Ronald Reagan, who had run in 1968 against Richard Nixon in the at the convention. Was not successful. Then he had run again in 1976 against incumbent Gerald Ford, was not successful. And then he was considered at 71 too old, and yet he made an astounding comeback and beat an incumbent president. And then there was, of course, Richard Nixon, who lost the 1960 election and then went to California, was humiliated, and lost in 1962 to Governor Brown, the elder Brown, and then yet 6 years later was elected president. But none of them had done what Trump had done in 2 aspects. One, not since Grover Cleveland had a president been elected and then rejected at the polls and then come back 4 years later and won not just an election, but an overwhelmingly positive landslide that was unambiguous the way Trump did. And then 2, no one in their descent, their wilderness years, not a Churchill, not a Reagan, not a Nixon, had been the object of 5 criminal or civil suits, had people try to take his name off the very ballot, 16 states, the target of 2 assassination attempts, impeached 2 times, that's a historical first, tried as a private citizen. And nobody had been subject to that level of lawfare of recuperation and yet recovered. So yeah, I think it's the greatest comeback of the modern era in American politics.
You talk about Nixon and Reagan. Perhaps there are other figures we could talk about, Thatcher and so on in the 20th century. Is Trump part of that great man or great woman tradition? Is he a great man?
Well, he's certainly unparalleled. There is no contemporary figure who could go out, announce he's going to speak, and 70,000 people would show up, whether it is in Wyoming or Red State, Utah, or at the center of liberalism in Madison Square Garden in Manhattan. No one has that ability. No one has that ability to work like he does. He works at 78, 16, 17, 18 hours a day. Nobody has seen anything like that. You could see pictures where Kamala Harris, who's 20 years younger, was yawning, asleep, or took a whole day off in the critical last 2 weeks. So he's a larger-than-life figure, and there's no one that I can think of who speaks anywhere, anytime, on any topic to anyone with no filters whatsoever, and has confidence that even if he makes a mistake or he says something inappropriate, the value of his truthfulness or candor will outweigh any downside of being too controversial or crude or cruel. So he has no filters, and he's confident that he has no filters.
He's also reshaped the Republican Party in his image, and some would argue he's reshaped America in his image. And yet he was up against a huge battle in 2024. Kamala Harris massively outraised him. She had the media class on her side. She had the Hollywood elite on her side. She had this huge get out the vote operation, advertisement, billboards everywhere, and yet she still lost. So why did Kamala Harris's campaign fail? Why did all of those weapons I talk about didn't work on Donald Trump?
Well, as I said, she was embracing an agenda that on every item did not poll 50%. She tried to correct that in that 100 days of hers by renouncing her positions or trying to, with a wink and a nod, disassociate herself from the border, from inflation, from crime, but she couldn't do that very successfully. So then it became a matter, will she be an Obama-like figure, that is, a charismatic African-American first. He was the first African-American. She would be the first woman and first African-American woman, and therefore people would ignore the agenda as they ignored Obama's left-wing agenda and voted for him. And the answer was, after they got to know her, that took about 45 days, they said to themselves, she's inane, she's inept, she doesn't know what she's talking about, she's out of her league, she will not debate unless the moderators have prepped the battlefield, she will not do press conferences, town hall. I can't imagine her voting, debating with Putin or Netanyahu or any of these major figures on the international stage. Therefore, she's a force multiplier of her bad agenda, the person, Kamala Harris. There were other things as well. That the choice of Tim Waltz did not help her. It was a force multiplier of her radicalism and her ineptness. The other things that there was a larger issue, though, and that's the traditional way the left exercises power. You mentioned that they had 95% of the media coverage that was statistically. That's 25 million evening viewers on all the network newses and cable shows. They had raised, if you count their PACs and her direct campaign expenditure, she spent over $1 billion. And as you said, she had everybody from Cardi B to Beyonce to Oprah. But what we learned from all of this is that an adroit politician can garner billions of dollars in free publicity if they're smart, like the garbage truck stunt, or working at McDonald's, or going to rallies, or creating controversies by their candor, or using podcasts, going on, targeting particular audiences like young men who are disillusioned, and going on Joe Rogan, and getting people to endorse them, that the endorsement would matter because they're not doubling down on a given. So if you get Oprah or you get Beyonce, who cares? They're liberals, you're a liberal, you're appealing to liberals, you've already got them. But if you get a Robert Kennedy Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard or Joe Rogan, they're bringing in different constituencies, and they're telling the American voter, It's okay now to vote for Donald Trump. There's no social opprobrium. You won't suffer. I'm voting for him. I'm a Kennedy. I'm Tulsi Gabbard. I was on the Democratic primary stage at one time. I am Joe Rogan. I don't endorse candidates. But for this, and that was very powerful. So he was able to create a system, an alternative system, antithetical system that nullified the institutional advantages and the money that she had on her side. But he was helped enormously by the fact that they had a losing agenda, and they had a terrible messenger, and they also had 4 years to remember of Donald Trump, which had been quite successful. The mystery that everybody's left with today, to be candid, Stephen, is Donald Trump won with about 74 million votes. She had about 68 million. Excuse me, he won with about 72 million, and she had about 68 million. And 4 years ago, he had 2 million more voters, and Joe Biden had 20 million more voters. So people want to know, where did the 20 million Democratic voters, did they all stay home? Because do they all flip to Donald Trump? The math doesn't work out. So people are perplexed where they are. And that brings up the question of, that was the year that we transformed the system into mail-in and early balloting. And maybe Donald Trump, for all the invective directed at him, might have had a point that there were a lot of missing ballots that were never accounted for. How can you win with essentially the same amount that you lost 4 years ago? The country's larger. It grows at 1% a year. It's got 4 or 5 million more people, how more registered voters. And how can Kamala Harris have far less votes than Joe Biden did? And how can Donald Trump win easily over her, but with a margin he still would have lost if Joe Biden really did repeat what he had been on the ballot and repeated what he did in 2020? Nobody can figure this out.
Let's look at some of the people who voted for Trump. Latino men, and men in generally, white men, young men, seem to have come out in droves for Donald Trump, and black men, of course, as well. On the other hand, you've got black women who overwhelmingly supported Kamala Harris and other female groups as well. Was this election the kind of revenge of the white man after years of being told they have white privilege, that whiteness itself is systemically racist and bigoted, and you've been at the top of the pile and now it's our turn? Was this the kind of revenge of the white man?
Well, 51% of white women voted for Donald Trump. That was astounding. And surely if you look at the media and listen to a Joy Reid or a Rachel Maddow, they will make that argument but they won't make it like you do, that there was justified cause giving the vituperation that was directed in racist fashion at the white collective. They'll say it was white racism. But what was astounding was it wasn't just white men or white women. First of all, they said there was a gender gap of 17, 18 points, and that was more important than the 17 or 18 points of male disapproval of Harris, because women voted at 52%, men at only 48. We found that to be fallacious. First of all, the gender gap in itself was only about 6 or 7 points, but it really was 15 or 16 as far as men in general. And particularly, we were told that all women would vote against him. White women did not vote against him. Why was that? I think people are tired of the tribalism and the collective, and so we have insidiously over the last 8 years or 10 years, or some from the Obama era, I would say the last 16 years since 2008 and 9, just taken it as a given that the way you talk collectively about people depends on the people you are talking about. You do not group black people or Hispanic people collectively in public discourse in a pejorative light. You don't say blacks are tending to do this, or Latinos have this privilege, or you don't do that. But you do with white people. It became acceptable to say white people are systematically racist, or for Mark Milley and Lloyd Austin to say they suffer from white rage or white privilege. And I think given the vast diversity in class and substance, what happened and the increasing diminution of race as far as a barometer of income, a lot of white middle class and lower class whites, especially in the Middle West, said, I don't have the money of Asians who are the most prosperous minorities statistically. I'm not doing as well as Joy Reid. I don't know why Ann Navarro was attacking me as a white. I have no money. And so there was this sense of resentment of being attacked. And Donald Trump was basically sending the message, I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. I have a woman running my campaign. I have black advisors. I'm going to get a record. If you think I'm racist, then why am I going to get more black votes than the supposedly moderate, ecumenical John McCain, Mitt Romney, Bob Dole, even George Bush? And he did. He got more Latinos and blacks than any other white Republican candidate. So it was kind of two things were going on. I agree that it was kind of the white population saying, I'm sick and tired of being disparaged collectively. I'm an individual, and I don't have privilege. And you keep saying that I do based on my race, but actually I don't. And then that led into the other narrative that I am Donald Trump and I'm making a nationalist populist party, and I am substituting racial solidarity. I'm substituting class solidarity for racial solidarity. So what he was telling people was, if you're a black truck driver, if you're a white electrician, if you're Hispanic roofer, you all have more in common as far as inflation, energy, foreign policy than do the elites of your party. If you're African American, you have nothing in common with Al Sharpton and the Obamas jetting out of one of their mansions. If you're Latino, you have nothing in common with the California legislator Latinos. If you're white, you have nothing in common with Joe Biden or John Kerry or any of these people. You all have things in common with each other. That's a very radical message. It's not fully developed yet, but just the very embryonic manifestations of it helped lead to this astounding victory. One thing you've got to remember, Stephen, is that we had about 20 polls, and it was very clear if you read the Brazilian poll carefully, Atlas, Intel, RU read Rasmussen, R. Trafalgar, and a couple more, but only those 4 or 5. And they were kind of the outliers. They didn't have the prestige of the New York Times Siena, the Washington Post ABC poll, the Quinnipiac, the Marist poll. But the point I'm making is they were warning everybody in the United States, and it was people had said to me and others, why did you think Trump was going to win? It was very easy because they were showing that Trump was going to win the popular vote. And they were admitting that they were trying to calibrate for what they called the quiescent or solitary or reclusive Trump voter, but even they thought they had underestimated him. The others were not. They were showing Kamala Harris at the end winning the popular vote, winning Iowa by 3 points, winning Pennsylvania. And then you would ask yourself, well, he's got the Amish coming out in Pennsylvania, we're told. He's got the union members coming out in Michigan. He's got Latinos who are polling at a 50-50 rate in the swing states. He has African American males at 26%. He's got the Teamsters Union. Somebody's lying to us and he's got 600,000 more Republican voters registered in Pennsylvania alone, and maybe 3 to 4 million more Republicans than in 2020 in the 7 swing states. And we got all of those criteria, and then here were these people were saying, no, she's ahead. Well, we knew she wasn't ahead, but we also knew that they were trying to build up momentum, affect the betting odds, getting donors to give last moment big gifting, and it was all rigged. And they're totally discredited, the polls are now, except for these 3 or 4 that were they were right on the money.
The Democrats for years have been boasting about this new demographic shift. The Republicans can never win again. You know, after 2008, they said look, the demographics are on our side. We've got minority voters in the bag. Texas is going to turn blue. And what actually happened was in Florida, which was so close in 2000, for example, in which Barack Obama won, it's now a solid red state. I think it more than 11 points, I think it was, went to Donald Trump. Texas, the same thing, more, in double digits securely for Donald Trump. And one of the biggest shifts in the entire country came among the Texas Latino voters on the southern border. Can you break down, because obviously there's a lot of Latinos in Florida as well, Puerto Ricans and so on. Can you break down what happened with Latino voters, Latino men? The left find it utterly bizarre that such a group of people would vote for Donald Trump when he's promising to deport illegal immigrants. That's literally what they say. So I know this is a big topic that you've talked about before, is Latino people. So what's going on there?
Well, Latino men, especially aged over 40, are the head of households, and they are very entrepreneurial, and they have gravitated to the muscular professions, and they're doing very well, especially after COVID. In other words, if you want a roofer or an electrician or a contractor to do cement work, you will find a first or second generation immigrant. And that will be a male over 40 that runs that business. And they feel that they are not keeping up. They did feel under Trump they were keeping up. In other words, their wages and compensation was rising faster than the rate of inflation. And they also felt that when the border was secure, number one, they weren't competing against cheap labor coming in the millions from Mexico. Two, they had gone through the hoops to get a green card or citizenship, but other people were being put at the front of the line who didn't deserve that. Number three, their reliance as the middle class on social services. Now, what do I mean by that? If your mother is on dialysis in Fresno and she usually has a 20-minute wait, and suddenly there's 30 people from Venezuela, Guatemala, Africa, and China wanting health care, and they've never been to a doctor, they walked across the border, then she's not going to get the same level of care. Or if their children are in a school and you've worked very hard in rural Tulare County to have advanced placement courses that are competitive with mostly white or Asian schools, say in Palo Alto or Malibu, and suddenly you're inundated in a racist fashion when this administration not only lets in 12 million people, but they bus and fly them into Hispanic neighborhoods. So then suddenly all of that's out the window because you have a quarter of your new student body need English as a second language remedial courses. Or your child may be a third generation Mexican American, he doesn't speak Spanish at all, and one of these young immigrants will come in from the Norteños or the Sureños or the M13 gang and say, hey, you're a gringo, you're a sellout, hey, and start picking on him. And this is happening everywhere. And so the Hispanic male is actually more conservative than the white male right now. And I'm not even getting into the issues that are not economic, that are force multipliers of their conservatism. One is the abortion issue on demand. That is the 10 to 15,000 abortions we do in this country where the fetus is actually liquidated in the birth canal, or the transsexual, transgendered issue, which doesn't resonate with the Latino community, or the profile of the Democratic Party as a urban, single, childless couple or empowered woman, when the Mexican American ideal is to have a family, a nuclear family, and child raising is a good thing to do. And you just, whether it's right or wrong, it's socially unacceptable for a traditional Mexican American family for someone to remain unmarried and not have children. And they don't see that as the norm. The Democratic Party sees that as their base. They don't. And so I was kidding around in another interview. I said, if this continues, the left will close the border because they'll conclude that all they're doing is getting a one-generation bump, and then they're getting a permanent adverse constituency. And I was surprised the last 2 days, if you go on social media, all of these left-wing people are talking about deporting Mexican people back to Mexico. So they're going to be, I think they're going to earn the reputation that Cubans or Hungarians have done in the United States, that we don't want these immigrants because they're too conservative.
How will history remember Kamala Harris and Tim Waltz?
Well, I think people will say that there was no criteria, there was no nomination process, there was no vetting, there's no way that this person, we've never had anybody become the candidate of any party, the major two parties, by coronation. She never has in her life won a primary. She's never won a delegate. She's never entered a primary. She was selected as Joe Biden's running mate because he had promised in that satanic bargain in 2020 with James Clyburn that after losing the first three primaries, he said to James Clyburn, if you can get the black vote out in South Carolina and I can defeat these radicals, I can defeat Donald Trump and the party will coronate me. And that's what happened. They all left. Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, they dropped out in the next 30 days by arrangement. So then he was selected, and part of the IOU was to select himself a vice presidential candidate who was black and likely female. Then the George Floyd riots ensued, and that he doubled down on that. He surveyed the landscape. There were not very many black women politicians. He selected Kamala Harris. Then the narrative changed and said she is his Spiro Agnew. In other words, like Spiro Agnew, who made the impeachment of Richard Nixon very unlikely at first because he was much more problematic than Nixon himself. So everybody said, well, maybe she was appointed so that Biden, with his criminal liabilities or his dementia, no one would ever think of removing him. Indeed, that was the narrative for 3 years. He was a joke. The Democratic Party said, aha, you can't get rid of Joe Biden. You may think he's demented, but would you like Kamala Harris? It was almost as if it was by intent. And then suddenly his dementia was so evident after the debate, and people were so alarmed in the polls that they changed the narrative within 48 hours, that she was turn the page, move forward Kamala. And she was articulate, she was Cicero, and that was never going to work. People had forgotten why she was selected and why she was not allowed to go out and have press conferences and why Joe Biden was not going to be impeached by the Republicans, because they did not want her as president. No one did. And then suddenly for 100 days we had collective amnesia, and we said, no, that was wrong. And now she's lost, as everybody knew she would. And now the left is saying she should have never been the nominee. They can't decide whether to blame Joe Biden for not getting out earlier and having an open convention, or for Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the Obamas anointing her without an open convention. They either blame him or her. But when they blame him, it's largely for selecting her. So she's going to have a Mike Dukakis retirement. By that I mean she's going to fade into pleasant obscurity in Los Angeles the way Dukakis did. He never ran for anything. He never was a public figure again. No one ever consulted him. He was considered one of the most inept candidates. And he was a much nicer person and much more articulate than she was. So her political career is over with. I don't even think the Google, Apple, Facebook consortia will come in and give her a multi-million-dollar ceremonial post that they often do to Democratic candidates that are unsuccessful.
I'm sure she'll write a book and do lots of expensive speeches. I noticed you didn't even mention Tim Waltz. I suspect that's because people will forget him probably by tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't think he's. Yeah, well, I think there was a point in the campaign where people were saying, had she picked Josh Shapiro, she would have won Pennsylvania. He was a moderate. He was articulate. And this guy is a pathological liar. He's inept. He's a buffoon. He has a mysterious relationship with China. But then as the campaign matured, they said, nothing would have saved her. Nothing would have saved her. He was just a minor footnote. It showed her bad judgment in picking them. He'd had a terrible debate. His polls are down, but Josh Shapiro wouldn't have saved her. The only thing would have saved her was if she had announced the moment she got the nomination, I respect Joe Biden, but I find him far to the left of me, and I have to turn the page, and I want to develop energy at full speed. I want to close the border immediately. I want to deport illegal aliens that came here unlawfully. I want to up the defense budget. I want to crack down on crime. I want to frack as much as we can. She said some of that, but it was so false and it was so transparently temporary that people came away with the conclusion, if we vote for this person and she wins, she will not implement any of the things she said. If she loses and she has 3 months left on her tenure, she won't implement anything she said. She will always revert, win or lose, back to who she really is. So this is just a hiatus of 3 months. That's what everybody thought. How do you win with that?
The left is saying now that they ran, some people on the left are saying Kamala ran a perfect campaign. It was Joe Biden's fault. It was inflation. It was his, him being unpopular. She couldn't have done anything else. Obviously, as you say, she chose a terrible VP candidate. She said, it admitted in a liberal softball interview with The View that she wouldn't change a thing from Joe Biden's legacy. And their campaign's attempts to go after men, for example, was a complete joke. They kept saying that men should try and protect their wives and daughters, but they had no direct message to men, what we're going to deliver for you. And then they were trying to kind of break up marriages by saying that women or wives should lie to their husbands and go into the electoral booth and vote for Kamala Harris. It's just utterly. Don't you think they ran a bad campaign? I mean, this seems to me this weird distortion of the truth from the left today, or some people on the left, that this was a perfect campaign.
I don't think anybody believes that. I think already people on the left are questioning that narrative. It was the worst run campaign in my lifetime. Maybe they can say that it was bad because it was truncated by the delay in the nomination, and she didn't run for a primary. But the money was wasted. The white dude commercials, women threatening not to have sex with their boyfriends, the fixation. They had seen Donald Trump for 4 years. He was many things. You could argue that he was sloppy, he was cruel, he was crude, but he was not fascist, he was not Hitler, he was not a dictator. He did not go after Hillary Clinton. He did not weaponize the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, the IRS in the manner that Biden and later, and earlier, Obama had. So that narrative never worked, that you can't vote for Donald Trump because he's a fascist or a dictator. Then the other narrative was, you can't keep saying that if you're Biden, who was helping her, that we need to put a bullseye on his head, or you can't keep attacking him as a fascist, as two people have tried to kill him. And so that neutered that narrative. And then what she had to do was to convince people, I am not an elite. I am not the child of two PhDs that grew up in Berkeley and a posh neighborhood of Montreal, and my entire life have been to the left of the Democratic Party and have the most left-wing record of all 100 senators in voting, including Bernie Sanders, and I was not introduced to politics by Willie Brown. And what did she do to dispel that stereotype? She went hard to the left with her endorsements. She hung around with movie stars. She avoided the press. She would not give a press. The only reason she even met with somebody like Brett Baier was when her polls were not 50-50. So everybody said, they're running out the clock, they're running out the clock, they're running out the clock. What are they going to do? 30 days left in the campaign. Now she's having interviews, but they're with Oprah, they're with the Association of Black Journalists, they're with basketball players. So she's got the moderators and debate on her side. And then they said, is she ever going to do what a normal candidate did? And finally, she did 1 or 2 60 Minutes, and people said, this is an utter train wreck. She was better off not being with the press. The moment she exposed her, I don't know what the word, stupidity or just cluelessness, she was over with. Nobody wanted her after they heard her speak. Every time she was asked 3 questions, that was all she had to do. There were just 3 questions she knew were going to be asked. We knew that she had, big binders in 20 fonts saying, this is what you say, A.B. First question, you were vice president for 3.5 years. Now you're running as a change candidate. Why didn't you implement these change issues, policies, when you were vice president, or right now before the election as vice president to a president that's not engaged? And the answer, I grew up middle class. I'm a middle class person. Question 2, you say that you are a change candidate, but on fracking, on reparations, on deportation, on the wall, on everything, you have flipped your position. Are you genuine now, or are you genuine then? I grew up as a middle class person, and I want to question 3. You assured us, chapter and verse, especially during your 100 days, that Joe Biden had been fit as a fiddle when asked. You said he was bold, he was dynamic, he took over the room with his energy. Then, in 24 hours, he was considered unfit, and you were the nominee. Are you telling the truth now about Joe Biden, or were you telling the truth then? I grew up middle class. She could never answer those 3 basic questions, and that really hurt her.
The other default answer she gave was on a question about immigration. They would ask her, you were the border czar, and yet you let in millions of illegal immigrants. How are you going to change that? And she would always say, I'm the only candidate who's ever prosecuted criminal gangs crossing the border and so on, and not actually
never answer a question. The second fallback was, I was for comprehensive immigration reform, and people would say it was not comprehensive, it wasn't immigration reform. It allowed 5,000 people to come in per day until it was enacted. And even when it was enacted, it was not deportation, it was basically a route toward amnesty. And yet she kept hammering that. And the more she hammered, she would say, well, it was bipartisan, and they would say there were more Democrats that voted against it than Republicans for it. And every time they would refute that, she would hammer down. Finally, the public caught on. And the thing was that she was losing momentum as the election took place. Had that election taken place 2 weeks later, it would have been even a greater rout. At the same time, the media, the pollsters, her campaign celebrities were telling us that she had the momentum, that they had now gone into red states like Iowa and flipped them. And so one thing that people came away with, this was the greatest effort at distortion and media conspiracy with pollsters we've ever seen. And this followed the 2016 and 2020 poll disasters. And I guess one of the reasons people are writing op-eds saying the media is through and the pollsters are through is that they doubled down. So 2016, they missed Hillary's defeat, so they said in 2020 we'll correct this. And then they doubled down and basically said Donald Trump would lose by 8 points. He lost by less than a point in the swing states. Then the moderators, first of all, the moderators in the Harris-Trump debate fact-checked Trump. They made him follow up. They were very partisan. So then they said, we're not going to do what they did to Trump during the Vance Waltz debate. And yet they doubled down. They could not help themselves. So people said, you know what? They cannot help themselves. They're not serious people. They were told not to rig a debate, and here yet they knew they weren't supposed to do it. They knew they weren't supposed to fact-check just Republicans, and they did it again. And they did it more flagrantly this time. So they really went full unapologetically. They mortgaged their reputations, and somebody called them in on it. I think they're kind of... Donald Trump won without the media, and he won without the the institutions. He didn't need the academic world. He didn't need the media. He didn't need Silicon Valley. He didn't need to rig the Google search orders. He didn't rig social media. He didn't need the administrative state. He did not need entertainment, the football, NBA. Didn't need any of that. All he needed was a platform on social media and podcasts, talk radio, and free publicity. And he was a master stuntman, and he'd been reality TV for 14 years, and a lot of things he just not given credit. When that garbage story came out that Biden had called half the nation garbage, that would have had about a 24-hour lifespan. But who would ever think of wearing a chartreuse vest and climbing into a garbage truck, and both cementing his fides as a man of the people and reminding what Biden had called half of America? He kept that story alive till Election Day.
Let's talk about Joe Biden. Let's move on from the campaign, and then I want to discuss Trump's second administration. We're coming to the end of Joe Biden's presidency. What is his legacy, and where do you rank him historically?
Well, I don't think he has a legacy. His legacy, as he sees it, is that he stopped Donald Trump, and that is what he's claiming now as his legacy. On the economy, he gave us hyperinflation. Prices for staples are 30% higher than when he entered office. Remember, Vladimir Putin did not leave his borders under Donald Trump. As soon as Biden was elected, he invaded Ukraine, and we had a war in the Middle East. And that was largely because he said to Putin, I won't object if it's a minor invasion. I'll fly Zelensky out if I need to. He suspended aid to Ukraine the first week, and then he diddled and daddled, gave some, took some back. He let a Chinese balloon traverse the United States. We were waving a pride flag from our embassy as they were blowing up 13 Marines, and we were flying people out that were falling from the airplane. We didn't vet any of the people who came in the United States from Afghanistan. Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were humiliated by the Chinese in March, the first couple of months of their term. He tried to appeal to the institutions for leverage. Before the midterm, he tried to cancel student debt. He tried to drain the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to get vote. He had his agents or his liaisons leak a Supreme Court decision that wasn't published yet on Roe versus Wade. That helped him in the midterm. So, and then of course there was the lawfare. We've never had a president that used the legal system to destroy his likely opponent. And I say that because I'll just take one example. On November 23rd of 2022, the following three things happened. Joe Biden selected Jack Smith as a special prosecutor to go after Donald Trump for the same crimes that he had exposure to, archival disputes about classified papers. Number two, the third man in his DOJ mysteriously resigned, who had come into the DOJ from Letitia James' suit against Trump, and could quickly, in a matter of a week, go join Alvin Bragg. So whoever resigns a prestigious federal prosecutor position to go to a local DA, unless it's after Trump. And third, that same day appointed Smith, and the same day his third top guy was going into a local suit against Trump, Fannie Willis's paramour was meeting in the White House with Joe Biden's White House counsel to coordinate the Georgia prosecution. So that, I think people are going to look back and say, never have we gone after an ex-president or a presidential candidate like the way we did. And the fact that Donald Trump was impeached on the similar allegations that he had gone after Joe Biden, who wasn't even nominated in 2020, but he had gone after him purportedly by worrying about corruption in Ukraine and making a phone call to Zelensky. So I don't think history is going to judge what he did favorably. And then finally, and most importantly, it was very clear early on that he suffered from either an Alzheimer's-like syndrome or dementia, and he worked, at the end of his tenure, he worked no more than 20 hours a week, and people serially and conspiratorially lied about his health. He never released really a full cognitive assessment. Again, juxtaposed to threats to 25th Amendment Donald Trump and force him to have a Montreal cognitive assessment, which he aced. So there was just such asymmetry in their standards of the way they treated the two. And Joe Biden gave us inflation, he gave us wars, and he gave us lawfare. That's his legacy.
We're in a new Trump era. Do you think he's learned his lessons from 2016?
Well, the lesson that he sees that I think is the correct one, that he came in with as a pariah from both parties and without much knowledge of Washington, which he had only, I think, visited 10 or 15 times. And he trusted the so-called deep state or wise men or uniparty. So he picked people that were prestigious, or they were titans of industry, or Jim Mattis, the general at Defense. John Kelly would be his chief of staff eventually. Rex Tillerson at State. And then he had a bunch of characters that were, frankly, kind of disreputable. The Scaramucci for a while as press secretary, Omarosa. So it was a complete carnival. And then he had people freelancing openly against him. The Secretary of Defense was attacking him and not wanting to get out of the Iran deal. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was directly attacking him when he was when John Bolton came in to replace H.R. He was actively leaking to the press against him. We had this anonymous, this minor figure in Homeland Security that was publishing op-eds in the New York Times bragging about, he used the word cabal of people who were trying to thwart Trump. And now we're told after 8 years, 4 in the wilderness, 4 in office, that Donald Trump is putting a high premium on vetting people, and they have 20,000 names, 5 people for each position that they claim, and one and the only critical criterion besides qualification is, are they loyal to the agenda? So we'll see, but I think he's going to surround himself with people who believe as he does in the new Republican Party. The corollary question is, did the people in the Republican Party who opposed him, the Bill Kristols, the David Frums, the Liz Cheneys, the Cheney family, the Bulwark, did they learn anything? And they were completely irrelevant. They got a lot of left-wing money, they were very loud, but they had zero influence on this election. And there is no Romney, McCain wing of the Republican Party. It doesn't exist. No Republican candidate can run for office and say, I promise if you elect me, I will slash capital gains, I will privatize Social Security, and I will go to war if I have to. That's not going to happen. Some of the ideas might have been valuable, but they're not tenable anymore. They come across as part of the elite aristocratic wing of the Republican Party.
I think one of the things that some conservatives were disappointed at with the first Trump administration, as you say, was the chaos. It was the poor appointments. It was the kind of narcissism of Trump rather than focusing on the bigger picture. But also they felt that he wasn't radical enough. He wasn't going after the swamp or draining the swamp or going after the deep state in the way that perhaps he could have or should have done. Do you think that after all the things you mentioned, the indictments, the impeachments, the assassination attempts, are we seeing a Trump that is truly radicalized? I mean, you would have thought in 2016, after all of the people going after him, he would have been more radical. But maybe in 2024, we're seeing a different Trump.
No, I think that they have decided, as they look back, that their change were ephemeral, and they look at Reagan as the obvious model. And even in Reagan, they feel that the Reagan Revolution, because it was not fundamentally changing institutions, was temporary. And I don't mean changing it in an unconstitutional or a radical self-interested manner, such as the Democrats. I don't think they're going to pack the court. I don't think they're going to end the Senate filibuster. I don't think they're going to admit 2 states. I don't think they're going to get rid of the electoral. All the things the Democratic people wanted to do had they won. But I do think they're going to do things that they feel are better for the country and will aid them in particular, such as physically breaking up this administrative state. So they've talked about things like, why is the FBI headquarters right in Washington, where people, these power couples that run the FBI hierarchy, they're married to spouses in media, they're connected with the CIA, the DOJ. Why not put it in Kansas City? Why not put the Department of Energy in Houston, where they're right on top of our energy sector? Do we really want the CIA to have all these divisions? Maybe some of these intelligence capacities could be spread out over others. Do we want it centralized, given what we saw with the Russian collusion hoax and the efforts of the CIA to subvert the 2016 campaign? And so the other problem is, why do we play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules? If it's institutionalized by the left that when Obama comes in or Biden comes in, they fire the entire DOJ staff that's political, and they have the right to do that, why would we worry about doing the same thing? We don't care whether they criticize us or not anymore, but we're going to do what they do and make a clean sweep. So I think there's a sense that they can change things that will last beyond their tenure. They talk about eliminating maybe 1 or 2 branches of the cabinet, maybe the Department of Education. That would be a good thing. They talk about, the Constitution says that the states are responsible for balloting, and then it has kind of a dash in the Constitution. It says, except from time to time, the federal government may intervene with a national law. And we did that with the 18-year-old vote and suffrage. And I think they're going to try to maybe suggest that all states should have to have some form of ID presented to get a ballot. That would make an enormous difference. So they're looking at things that will transcend their 4 years.
To what extent does the old guard Republican elite have power today? I'm looking at Mitch McConnell, for example. You know, he's still going to be there until 2026 unless he's actually removed from his position in the Senate. And I know that in the first Trump administration, Paul Ryan and others had a huge influence. For example, they passed their tax cut, but they didn't help him on funding for the border wall. So how has that dynamic changed?
It has changed because I think we mistakenly look at the numbers, say, in the Senate, and we adjudicate, well, if he has 51, he can do things he can't do, or 53 or 54. What's changed, when he came into power in 2017, he had the Senate and the House, but if you looked at them, the House was run by Paul Ryan. And in the Senate, you had senators like Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, John McCain, that were openly hostile, not just to Trump, to his agenda. They're all gone now. So he doesn't need that sizable majority anymore. And the Speaker of the House is on the MAGA page. Whoever will be the Senate leader, and they'll select that within 2 or 3 weeks, will be on the MAGA page. And all 53 or 54 senators will be on the MAGA. So they don't need the insurance margins that they used to have, because there's almost no dissension anymore. And there's no dissension, especially after this landmark victory. And people are looking around at these Senate races. You mentioned the Senate. And they're saying, how did we Republicans overthrow incumbent Democratic senators in Montana, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and came very close in Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona? Those are still out. How did we do that? Well, the only reason we did it is because of Donald Trump was able to generate enthusiasm and have coattails. And what happened to senators who said, you know what, he's too polarizing, I'm in a purple or blue state, I will appeal to moderates by being vehemently anti-Trump, like Larry Hogan in Maryland. He got killed. So there is no alternative to him. And there's no alternative to him because the never-Trump traditional Romney-esque part said, this man is a racist, he can't appeal to the new demography. He turns off women, and then they look at the results and they said, he got more women, white women than we did. He got more Latinos. He got more blacks. He got more young people. And in a state like New York, we haven't had those margins in 30 years. He got within 8 points. And in California, he flipped 20 counties that had gone for Democrats for 20 years into red counties. No one's ever done that. So whatever he's doing is now going to be the orthodoxy. We'll see how long it lasts, but no one is going, anybody in their right mind knows if they run as a Bush, Romney, McCain Republican, they won't win. There's no way in the world they can. And you can see it with the Europeans. They're so angry, but I was talking to somebody in the Trump transition team, and he said, we can't handle the calls from European and foreign leaders. They're coming in at every second from the foreign minister, from the president, from the prime minister. Everybody wants to talk to Trump. Everybody wants to assure Trump they were on his team, that they agree with him, they support him. That wasn't true in 2016. And so they feel at least he has a singular level of public support, and he's going to do things that are going to be very radical. Even when you have the Houthis announce a few hours after the election that they want peace in the Red Sea, and you had Hamas yesterday say that as far as they're concerned, the war is over and they want an agreement. And you haven't heard a word out of Iran. Why is that? Because he won the popular vote, he won the electoral college, he has enormous support, and he's entirely, in their view, unpredictable and can't be controlled by their usually levers of influence. They can't call up somebody in the Pentagon. They can't rely on a New York Times op-ed. They can't get Robert Malley to say something. They have no control over him, and that frightens them.
He does face huge challenges, though, particularly on the economy. The US debt is staggeringly high, and his plans to cut taxes for mass deportations, other very costly policies could expand the deficit. I know that he wants to appoint Elon Musk to create government efficiency. Maybe you can talk about some of those challenges on the economic perspective, but also in foreign policy, ending the war in Ukraine. I know he says he's going to do it on day one, but that's going to be an incredibly difficult thing for him to negotiate. Yeah. Are the Ukrainians going to accept it? Are the Europeans going to accept it? And there's other major crises in the Middle East and so on. So what about all these challenges he faces?
Yeah, well, very quickly, his biggest problem is, as you say, that what's going to be $37 trillion in debt, and the interest on it at these high interest rates is higher than the defense budget. It's $1.2 trillion a year. And what usually happens, candidates say they're going to deregulate, cut taxes, create greater productivity, greater GDP, and you'll get more revenue. That's happened before. Under Reagan, it happened under Trump. But the spending outpaced the revenues, because there's two areas that they don't dare touch. One is Social Security, Medicare, and the other is the Republicans are going to increase the defense budget. So where's the other third that would be you could cut? And that is things that we have said you can't cut. You can't cut a cabinet. You cannot cut things that individually are not that expensive, but they're representative of things you could cut. PBS, NPR, the National Endowment for Humanity, all of these things that came in the Great Society and later. Well, Elon Musk says he can cut $2 trillion. Mostly we don't listen to that, because every time they say we're going to cut waste and abuse and fraud, it never matters anything. But we'll see. I don't think his plan of giving tax relief for tips and Social Security, coupled with deregulation and all that, is going to create so much productivity and so much additional revenue that he can balance or get near a balanced budget, much less try to pay down, unless he has these cuts. And so we'll see. I should say that illegal immigration is a huge drain. It's $200-300 billion. As far as Ukraine, very quickly, I think everybody knew what the deal was. They've discussed it. Zelensky, as you know, probably talked somewhat on those lines to Putin right after the saving of Kiev. And it's what can each side walk away with and say that they didn't lose, and how do you stop 1.2 million dead, wounded, and missing on both sides? It's the worst thing since World War II. And I think what they're going to do is say, Ukraine was never going to get back the Donbass or Crimea. They never were. When they took it under Obama, he didn't stop it. He didn't say get it back. Biden didn't say get it back. Trump didn't say get it back. So they're probably going to say, well, Vladimir, you can go back and tell the Russian people that maybe they would have tried to get it back, but now it's institutionalized as Russian, and that's why you went to war. The second thing you went to war for is you didn't want them to be in NATO on your border. And I think Trump would probably concede that. And then he would go to Putin and say, we want a demilitarized zone between you and Ukraine. We want you to get back where you were when you invaded on February 24th of 2022. We won't put it in NATO. You can have Ukraine and, as I said, the Donbass, but we'll probably allow them to be a European Union member if they want. And then Zelensky can say, I saved Ukraine from being absorbed by Russia. It's now in the EU, and we're kind of armed to the teeth. And I think that's what he's going to do. But and I think he's going to say in the Middle East, I'm sure he said it now to Netanyahu, I ran on no optional wars, so I am not going to go in there and bomb Iran. I would like to, but I can't politically. So if you want to do it, we will give you the intelligence and we will give you aid, and you give us plausible denial. We'll just say, you know what, finish the war. You've finished with Hamas. You've almost taken out Hezbollah. Suddenly Hamas wants peace. There's even peace feelers coming out of Hezbollah. Iran has no defenses now. You've taken them out. If Iran hits you again, do what you want. We don't care. In fact, we approve it. And there's going to be no restriction on what Israel does. And I think they would end the war then. And he won't have to say that it's kind of the Soleimani or Baghdadi approach to the Middle East, where he takes out problematic people and he says, you know, there's no better friend, no worse enemy in America. We don't intervene in people, but screw with us, and we have a Jacksonian policy. Iran hates us. We don't like them. They've caused trouble for 30 years. They kill people. They interrupt shipping. And now they've got Israel on their back, and Israel knows how to deal with them. And as far as we're concerned, more power to Israel. And that's very different than the Biden administration.
Some great men in history do amazing things in their life. Bismarck, Lord Salisbury, British Prime Minister, Napoleon and others. But the problem they have is, or historians criticize them for not leaving a true legacy. They don't have someone to hand over the baton to. I want to ask about Trump, the future of the Republican Party, the future after Donald Trump. Obviously, he can't run again. He's going to be too old anyway, but this is his second term. How do you assess the future after Donald Trump? I'm thinking of people like J.D. Vance.
Well, when he is selected, J.D. Vance, the media ridiculed him, and people in the party and some pundits said this was a terrible mistake because they were using the traditional calculus. They said, he is a white person from a red state. He picked a white person from a red state. So J.D. Vance will not flip a state for him that is purple, and he will not appeal to Latinos or blacks or other non-white people. That was the traditional calculus. He said, I picked him for two reasons. He is about the most adept debater, and I'm going to turn him loose on the media in debate, and he will defend the MAGA agenda far better than I can, and he will and he fulfilled that. And second, he comes from Appalachia. He's seen through his literary and film and financial career the one-eyed Jack, the other side of what these people are like. He knows them better than he's not naive. He actually had a flirtation with the left and was critical of me. That's what Trump would say. And he's the one person that I can trust that after I'm gone will continue the MAGA agenda and continue it with a very effective messenger. And so if you look at why he was selected, I think you'll see that it was largely due to Donald Trump himself, Eric Trump, and Donald Trump Jr. over the objections of all the political consultants. And I think it worked out exactly, like Trump said it would. But after the Harris boomlet, or the romance, or the joyful period of July and August, you got to remember that all of the Republican hierarchy and the Wall Street Journal and everybody were saying that this was a terrible mistake, that he was too far right, that he called women cat ladies, he was going to ensure that he would lose the female vote because of him. Trump never wavered. In fact, he said he's very smart. He always said, I like him, he's got the brain, he's a smart guy, and he's going to do to the media what I'd like to do to them. And he did. It was a very inspired pick.
So the future is bright for the Republicans, and it looks like the contrast between J.D. Vance and Mike Pence couldn't be clearer. Thank you so much, Victor Davis Hanson.
That's a good way of ending it, Stephen. That's a very astute observation that he's got a charismatic, dynamic young person who genuinely likes Donald Trump as a person and embraces his agenda, rather than a very familiar and kind of older politician who feels it's his duty to make excuses for Donald Trump and his heart isn't in it. That's a big difference. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more content, please subscribe to our new GBN America YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.